Hi, everyone. You are welcome to this webinar. We are here today to celebrate someone. We are here to celebrate Professor Shola Omotola, who is a great African political scientist. He's done a lot of work working on African problems from the political science perspective. And we are celebrating him today, not because of himself, but because of his achievements and his leadership. If you saw in the email that we sent out, one of his students actually met him for the first time when he was researching and learning about political science in Nigeria. Then he met Professor Omotola Shola, and from that moment, Professor Omotola became a light in his life. Moving forward, Professor Omotola is recognized both nationally and internationally because of his achievements. Trained in Nigeria, worked in Nigeria, developed in Nigeria, but he has attained the world stage. This gives us a clear vision of whom Professor Omotola is. And currently, Professor Omotola holds the Claude Ake Visiting Chair jointly hosted by the Department of Conflict and Peace Research, University of Uppsala, and the Nordic African Institute in Sweden, during which he researched on the reincarnation of military coup in Africa. He is Professor of Comparative Politics at the Federal University of Oye-Ekiti in Ekiti State, Nigeria, where he completed his tenure in March 2023 as Deputy Vice Chancellor. He has served in various other capacities in the university, including as Dean of Faculty of Social Sciences, Director of Research and Development, concurrent Head of Department of Political Science and Department of History and International Studies, and as a member of the Governing Council of the university. He was in 2017 a visiting professor at the Beirut International Graduate School of African Studies, University of Beirut in Germany. He also had a postdoctoral fellowship in the Department of International Relations at the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa. So that is the person we are celebrating today. And how did I know about Dr. Shola? Through his works. And when I spoke to a friend, a colleague of mine, about Dr. Shola, he told me we need to celebrate Dr. Shola. And as soon as I reached out to Dr. Shola, he accepted, he did not question, he did not doubt, he did not complicate. That to me was a sign of humility. That to me was a sign of someone who is ready to serve. So welcome to this webinar. Welcome to our guests, and I hope you're going to take a lot out of this presentation. So I'll start by introducing all the guests to you. I have already spoken a lot about Dr. Shola. I think I should bring Dr. Shola on stage so you actually see whom Dr. Shola is. Hi, Prof. You're welcome.
Thank you so much, my brother. You are doing a very, very great and fantastic job for us in Africa, and we quite appreciate that. And thanks also for this privilege.
Thank you so much for coming, and thank you for accepting to share your knowledge with us today.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Good. After Dr. Shola, I'll introduce to you Dr. Ngang. This is a gentleman with whom I have a very special relationship. If I'm here today, if I am whom I am, it's because Dr. Ngang held my hand over the last 4 years, showed me what research is, and directed me, corrected me, gave me critical feedback. And of course, I am proud to be where I am. And thanks to Dr. Carol, who is currently the UNDP Human Rights Chair at the National University of Lesotho. Welcome to the program, Prof. I think you are muted.
No, my mic is on.
Go on now.
All right. So, yeah, thank you very much, Bernard, and thank you for the honor to be invited to share in Professor Omotola's Golden Jubilee.
Thank you so much. The next panelist whom I'm going to bring here is someone whom I met also at a networking event, and he has always accepted to be here. He was the first guest that I interviewed on my podcast, Beyond Africa. And here again, he is sharing his knowledge and his presence with us. Welcome to the program, Dr. Robinson Tomberi Sibe, the CEO of Digital Forensics, Digital Footprint Nigeria.
Thank you very much, Bernard. Always a pleasure to be on your show, and always honored to discuss and speak about Africa. Also very glad to be here to celebrate Professor Shola, a great Nigerian and a great African scholar. We're very honored to share the stage with him.
Thank you so much, Dr. Robinson. So, dear viewers, we are happy that you're all here with us, and we're going to go straight into the conversations that we planned for today. We are reflecting on the state of democracy, elections, and development in Africa. Professor Shola called this the troubled trinity. So, Prof, we would like to hear from you. Before we get into that, I want to give room to the other two panelists to say a word or two as we celebrate Prof's birthday today. So we start from that light mood and celebrate Prof in grand style before we get into the conversations, which seem to be, which is promising to be very, 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 very heavy. So let me start with Dr. Robinson.
Yeah, like I said, I'm very honored to share the stage with Prof. It's not every day you come across someone whose students are even rallying around to celebrate him. It goes a long way to show what the person he is and what level of sterling contributions he's made to scholarship, to his students and to Nigeria and to Africa. So I join his students to wish you, sir, happy birthday. And hopefully I would also get to tap from your wisdom going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Robinson. Let's hear from Dr. Carroll.
Yeah, thanks once more, Bernard. When you reached out to me, inviting me to join in this show, I immediately rushed to Google to find out who Prof Omotola is. Before then, I had never known about him, maybe because I come from a law background and he comes from a political science background. So it just happened that our paths never crossed. And when I Googled him, I went straight to his Google Scholar profile. And I was so, wowed by his academic accomplishments, right? So I wonder that maybe in the course of my research, I never came across any of his publications to have, informed my own research. But, I was really, moved by the level of accomplishment. And, I could see that Prof Omotola is an accomplished researcher, an accomplished academic, and one that everybody would like to associate with. And I'm very grateful for this opportunity, to connect with him. And I hope that after this, henceforth, we will surely keep contact. And just to also wish him a very blessed 50th anniversary Golden Jubilee, and to say more grace to your elbows, Prof, for your academic accomplishments. You are an inspiration to scholars in Africa, and we hope that henceforth to keep contact and be able to maybe have some collaboration after this conversation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Carroll. I was reading on somebody's Facebook page today, and that person was talking about webinars creating that close knit of individuals, because webinars are more of a focus, a place where people meet to discuss specific thematic issues. And that is how I met Dr. Robinson, and you are meeting Professor Shola now, and that is exactly what we're talking about. The interaction between experts, between people who do things together. this is where we meet, and this is where we are going to build that network that can shape certain things or certain trajectories in Africa. Prof, do you want to say one word about these sweet words that have been ushered on your behalf?
Yeah, thank you so much, my brother. Honestly, I must say that I feel highly humbled and honored at the same time, because my colleagues, for even accepting to join this particular webinar, they have demonstrated extensive graciousness to me. And now again, to now complement that with the generosity of their expression about me, I think that is really, really impressive. I want to thank all of you for those kind words you have expressed. And I want to thank Bernard in particular for making this thing to happen, because on this platform now, you have created new network for me going forward. And I can assure you, my brother, Professor Carol, definitely will take this conversation beyond this webinar. Of course, I know that Dr. Robinson, I know, is my Nigerian brother. So it's an opportunity for me to link up with you. I know definitely as a cybersecurity expert, who have a lot of things to do in this era of fake news, hate speech, and this now people are talking about deploying artificial intelligence in election, in democracy and stuff like that. So I know definitely there are areas we can collaborate. So I thank you so much for that generosity with those expressions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof. When I shared the invitation to this webinar with a friend, the topic was clearly democracy, elections, and development. And the friend asked me, why are you bringing a tech engineer, cybersecurity person into an arena where we're discussing elections and democracy? I immediately remembered my last conversation in January with Dr. Sibe. It is the first video on the YouTube platform. If you want to see it, go there and you'll find it. Dr. Sibe was actually discussing about the cybersecurity threats that elections face and how we can resolve those. And in the midst of that conversation, talking about development, Professor Ngang is so deep into research on development on the African continent, the right to development. So it is a mix of technology. We are at the point where technology rules everything. And if we keep technology out of our conversations, we are definitely taking a step backwards, not even remaining stagnant. So with that said, let me come to you, Prof. I would like to have your impressions about certain things or certain declarations that you've made in the past, particularly regarding the future of Africa and where we are today. In your inaugural speech titled "The Troubled Trinity: Elections, Democracy, and Development in Nigeria." So I want to reference that particularly, but I have taken the latitude to replace Nigeria with Africa. So yeah. If something doesn't sit well, kindly let me know that that it's not well seated. So you say the topic sits pretty well at the intersection of your cross-cutting research and publications on elections, democracy, and development in the broader subfield of comparative politics, including the institutional parameters such as election management bodies, political parties, civil society, gender, legislative studies, and oil and environmental politics, all woven into the framework of the deepening crises and contradictions of Africa. The central theme that runs through the lecture is simple and can be stated thus: elections are cardinal foundations of democracy. While there can be elections without democracy, the reverse is impossible, meaning that not all elections engender democracy, and that democracy is impossible without elections. But only elections can fulfill certain minimum conditions, notably promote democratic participation, competition, and legitimacy can do so. However, African elections have always fallen short of these standards with varying degrees of integrity, thereby undermining the democratic process. So at this point, what do you make of this assertion? Nigeria just came through with elections. Senegal came through with elections. In December, Ghana is going in. In 2025, Nigeria is going in. So what is your impression overall about elections and the state of democracy in Africa today?
Okay, thank you so much, moderator. Yeah, I think you have finished the whole lecture for us, because the excerpt you just read from that inaugural lecture is just the summary of my argument, okay, across most of my publications. And the key point is, whether we like it or not, election remains very, very critical, very, very central to the organization of any democratic society. But like you rightly read in that inaugural lecture, not all kinds of elections, okay, we do. There are facade elections, elections that are conducted just to fulfill democratic rituals, to satisfy the demands, to fulfill, the conditions imposed by donor agencies, by development partners, and stuff like that, without necessarily fulfilling democratic functions of elections. Like I have always argued, and in line with the extant literature on the subject matter, there are three important ingredients of elections, okay, when you want to talk about the integrity of any electoral process. One, you talk about the degree of competition engendered by that election. You talk about the degree of competitiveness of those elections, and you talk about the level of legitimacy engendered by those elections. Because of time, I will not be going into unpacking the components of each of these three cardinal functions of election in a democracy. But I think the key message is that for any election to live up to its responsibilities, it must be able to fulfill those three fundamental conditions. Unfortunately, for most African countries, I think those conditions are in short supply in terms of the way we conduct our elections. And that is why when you go through the report of international election observer groups and even local election observer groups, you find quite a plethora of issues that they will raise, arising from their observation of those elections, showing that those elections did not live up to democratic standards, okay, or established international best practices. So on the basis of that, we have elections characterized by low level of integrity. And when the integrity of election is poor, is low, definitely it has implications for the entire democratization process and for development in itself. So the key message we are talking about now is that when you look at Africa, it is time for us to begin to have a reconsideration, okay, about the kind of elections that we conduct. Because as we have them today in most of those African countries, Nigeria inclusive, you spoke about the last election in Nigeria in 2023. I'm sure you must have followed the trends before, during, after the election. And even despite the fact that, at least technically speaking, the electoral processes ended when court gave the final verdict, okay, on the electoral petitions. But even despite the verdict of the court, you see some segment of society still being agitated, still contesting, the outcome, the processes and the outcome of that particular election. When you have those kind of tendencies in any political system, it has a way, it affects the process of social cohesion, the process of national integration, the process of building elite consensus, okay, to support, to drive the process of development. And if you ask me, one of the fundamental fallouts, okay, of the last election in Nigeria is the fact that it has led to a situation whereby the Nigerian elites are now divided more than we have ever experienced in the history of this country, okay, just because of that, the way certain things went in that election. Then we are beginning to witness, and this is not just peculiar to Nigeria, increasing judicialization of the electoral processes, whereby electoral issues, party issues that are supposed to be resolved within political parties are increasingly being taken to the court. And when you are having increasing number of political cases before the court, such tendencies has a way it exerts pressure, okay, on the judiciary, okay, on the judges, putting a lot of pressure on them. And when the pressure is on the increase, there's every tendency for some of them to get compromised in the process of trying to deliver electoral justice. And that partly explains why today some scholars are now talking about what they call autocracy. It's a local term, okay, that some scholars have just developed now to explain that tendency. And I think they use it to describe a situation whereby increasingly, rather than electoral outcome being determined, okay, by the electoral management body, in Nigeria we call them INEC, you now find a situation whereby increasingly it is the courts, okay, that are now determining the outcome of the electoral processes. And like I said earlier, this is not peculiar to Nigeria. We have those tendencies in many other countries where electoral competitions end up in the courtroom, where people fight dirty. You know, even people at the highest level of the judicial system compromising certain aspects of the search for electoral justice. So when you have this kind of tendencies because of election, one, you are already affecting the foundation of the democratic process, because that election is an important component of the foundation of democracy. So once you get it wrong from there, then definitely it will affect quite a number of other issues that will follow. So when you put all these things together, so much so that electoral processes and outcomes generating issues of violence, leading to the escalation of fake news, escalation of hate speeches, and again, all these tendencies I'm talking about, these pathologies are not peculiar to Nigeria. We find them across many other countries in Africa. Even when you go to Ghana, for example, in the recent past, we used to celebrate Ghana as the ideal model of electoral democracy on the continent of Africa. But I think in the last couple of years, the narratives are beginning to change, okay, even in Ghana. So the point I'm making is that it is a continental-wide issues affecting most part of the continent. And that partly feeds into this phenomenon of democratic backsliding, okay, where you find those democratic values, okay, democratic principles are no longer being respected. They are being violated. And I think the peak of that backsliding manifest in this resurgence of military coups in the Sahel and in West Africa, broadly speaking. If you look at the last 3 years or thereabouts in West Africa and the Sahel, there have been about 6-7 successful military coups, okay? And there have been some other ones that were also not successful. And that tells us...
Prof, we'll come to talk about the military coups in a moment. I just want to have a feel of your developments, how from the other discussants, what they think, right? Dr. Carroll, you are in the field of, you concentrate so much on the field of development, the right to development governance and the development of Africa. Prof mentioned something about organizing elections in Africa for the simple reason to comply with donor conditions, because the aid donors oblige African countries to organize elections. Do you see that as a plus or as a minus to the successful or to the success of organizing elections in Africa?
Yeah, I agree with Prof Omotola, and I'll start from the premise of the social contract, right, where elections are a mechanism for citizens to surrender their sovereignty to elected representatives on the condition that the elected representatives will guarantee the protection of their rights. Now, when we look at the scenario in Africa currently, this year 2024, we have 19 presidential and parliamentary elections that are scheduled to take place. That is in 19 countries across Africa, in addition to 4 other countries that are just having legislative elections alone. And so that is, we will describe it as an election year for Africa. Now, the question is, what are these elections going to produce? What change are they going to, bring to the development landscape in Africa, right? I ask these questions because in my understanding, all the processes that we go through, the electoral processes, the democratic processes, in my view, are supposed to contribute to development on the continent. But when we look back at elections that have taken place in previous years and the ones that are scheduled for this year, we ask the question: what change are these elections going to bring? I will take an example of South Africa, which is considered to be one of the most advanced constitutional democracies in the world. Since 1994, South Africa has had successful, elections, democratic elections that have resulted in, peaceful transfer of power, right? From 1994 up to date, 30 years down the line, after the collapse of apartheid. When you look at, the outcome, the output, nothing much has changed in South Africa, right? We have the situation where, more than half of the South African population is still largely impoverished, right? Of a population of over 60 million, over 30 million South Africans are still living in extreme poverty, in spite of, the promise of constitutional or transformative constitutionalism that is enshrined in the South African Constitution and in the South African constitutional order. We have other situations like in Kenya, where after the election of President William Ruto, in spite of his charisma, in spite of the belief in President Ruto as as a very suitable candidate for Kenya, and maybe also an inspiration for Africa in his ideology about African unity. But few months down the line after his elections, the same citizenry that voted him into power were on the streets, protesting and expressing grievances against escalating cost of living. We also have a similar situation in Nigeria, where after the election of President Bola Tinubu last year, the Nigerian, it is reported that the Nigerian cost of living in Nigeria has continued to escalate. Then we ask the question: are these elections really relevant? And like Professor Omotola has rightly explained, they are just like ticking the box, ticking the the boxes for in order to secure development financing from international financial institutions like the World Bank, the IMF, and other donor institutions. Right. So we might want to ask the question whether is it not relevant to start to think of alternative models of democracy, and that can lead to improved living standard for the people of Africa. When I talk of development, I'm not looking at development from the point of view of economic growth, infrastructural development, or technological advancement. I'm looking at development from the point of view of human well-being, from the point of view of improvement in human standard and standard of living for the people of Africa. All across Africa, the story is just similar across the whole continent, where standards of living are extremely low. the level of extreme poverty is, you know, is beyond comprehension. We have in Nigeria, for example, of the population of about 200 million people, about 87 million of the Nigerian population are living in extreme poverty. You know, the second largest impoverished population in the world after India. That is a very worrying concern, in spite of the potential for development, the natural resources that, you know, Nigeria has, and, you know, the potential for development, which should contribute to well-being for the Nigerian citizen, but that has not been the case. Similar situation in South Africa, where of a population of about 60 million, about 30 million or a bit more are living in extreme poverty. Then we ask whether, or of what potential are the elections that, you know, we conduct very regularly across the African continent.
All right, thank you so much, Prof.
At that point, yeah.
Yeah, we'll get back. There's a comment from Bilal who is actually appreciating the fact that there is a sense in which we are beginning to question the legitimacy of the very essence of elections in Africa, since, as people have actually stated, there is no significant change in the lives of citizens as we spend so much money organizing elections. Let me come to you, Dr. Robinson. Prof also spoke about divisiveness among citizens, and Dr. Carroll has mentioned that the conflicts amongst citizens after elections have been conducted. Now, the question is, from a technical point of view, or from online studies, or from online presence, what is the very essence of citizens going in for elections today, and then the next day there is so much division amongst themselves, quarreling online, exchanging jabs online, kind of arguing amongst themselves as if they do not agree with the results of the elections? That, I think, that is mostly seen online. What is your take on that?
Yeah, I think it's largely a reflection of their trust in the process, the fact that citizens don't trust the electoral process. That's basically the reason why you see some of those arguments. I know we are very passionate people in Africa, and people tend to support their candidates very fiercely, including tribal, in some very extreme cases. Some are peddling tribal sentiments. In other cases, some are peddling religious sentiments. And so you have all these very heated motives. But I would believe that it's to address things like this. That's why technology was introduced in elections. Unfortunately, I'm not sure if you look at the last few decades and you look at a reflection of, you do an analysis of if technology has actually brought trust and transparency to the electoral process. I think that is something that will form another webinar or perhaps another series, because it can't be exhaustively discussed in a single shot. So yes, it will continue. Technology is also there to blow out. People are comfortably hiding behind their keyboards and their keypads, and they're able to type all sorts. Technology can allow you broadcast and amplify your voice, and project your opinion on others. Like Prof mentioned earlier, artificial intelligence, you can do deep fakes that mimic or that falsely represent someone saying something he didn't say. So technology has also amplified that, because without technology, probably somebody would have been in his house speaking about these things and you wouldn't see or hear him. Back in the days, in the 80s, the early 80s, only those whom you heard from afar are those who made it to the radio stations. But today, technology has liberalized that space, that democratic space, which is good for people to hear your voice. But at the same time, it has also created another challenge. If you look at the electoral threat landscape today, any little thing goes wrong, technology can also amplify it, and it becomes another issue. So yeah, one would believe that if things are done right, if citizens trust the electoral process, if citizens, if there's end-to-end verifiability, if there's transparency in the process, And all of these are things that technology should make possible, because the same way you deposit your money in the bank, and tomorrow your money is still there. Even if someone takes your money, there's always that digital trail, and you can make reports and find out who took your money. That's how technology should be. That if you cast your vote, there should be footprints that would show that, yes, I'm not talking about divulging your identity, because that's a fundamental aspect of elections, the fact that there should be anonymity of your votes, but at least that anything that happens to your votes, that vote count should be valid. It should not be manipulated. It should have, the process should have integrity. It should be auditable, and it should be verifiable. These are things that will boost the transparency of the process.
Thank you so much. Someone has asked a question. Dr. Roderick Ndi from Cameroon says, Prof mentioned that aid donors give. Let me read what he says. Greetings once more. Prof made mention of the aid donors give and the conditions linked to this. I wish he expatiates how donor aid conditions impact elections in Africa with practical examples. Prof, could you just speak a little bit to that?
Okay, thank you so much. Let me appreciate my colleagues for those useful interventions they have made. For me to answer that question, we have to go back to the history of liberal democracy in Africa, particularly under the third wave of democratization. And if you look at the way that democracy project was packaged, it was packaged and delivered to the people as the final solution to virtually almost all the problems afflicting the continent. So it was like you just have democracy, then every other thing will be added onto you. That was the way it was packaged. And with that packaging, you saw a kind of serious protest in capital cities of most African countries saying, no, we want to take democracy. Democracy was the answer at that point in time. But years down the line, of course, the local elites bought into that idea because they know it's also suited their own purposes. Okay? So the point I was trying to make was that the original intention, the motive of the so-called democracy promoters, okay, or exporters from the metropole to this part of the world, they had a completely different motive. And African elites saw that they could take advantage of that process. So they bought into that packaging. But decades down the line, we are now beginning to see what I call democratic disequilibrium. Okay? And when I speak about democratic disequilibrium, in terms of the demand for democracy and the supply of democracy. On the demand side, if you ask an average African today, and there are quite a number of survey data out there, Afrobarometer and a few other organizations, that which system of government will you still consider or will you recommend for Africa? The data are out there. Majority of Africans are still saying they consider democracy as the best form of government, which is fine. But when it comes to the supply side, you now ask them whether they were getting, whether democracy was actually fulfilling its promises to Africans. That is where the problem starts from. You will see the figure going down. Majority of Africans say no, democracy has not delivered on its promise. So when you have that mismatch between the demand for democracy and the supply of democracy, those are the kind of situations that we have. But I'm saying, despite the fact that democracy has not delivered, our leaders kept insisting that democracy is the path to go. And I'm not questioning the foundation of democracy. It's that form of democracy that I'm talking about, the liberal version. And that's why I was so happy when Dr. Carlos spoke about, he qualified his assertion that we needed to begin to question the type, the model of democracy. So for me, the problem is not about democracy per se, because when you speak about democracy, irrespective of whatever model, it is all about the people. And that is the link between democracy and development. Both are essentially about the people. It is the people that are at the center of democracy and development. So any democracy that is not advancing the welfare, the interest of the people, definitely it cannot translate to development. So, but it is strange why our elite, the key decision makers at the highest level of government, if you raise those kind of conversations, that look, we need to begin to interrogate, okay, the kind of model of democracy, especially this liberal version that we are practicing. You see the kind of responses, the kind of reactions they exhibit. So why are they not willing to even allow us to have a platform to have genuine conversation as to whether this liberal democracy, okay, has really been working, has really been delivering on its promise? For me, the answer is that because it is serving their own interests, therefore, any consideration about any other alternative for them should not even be contemplated. Okay, so
a quick follow-up. A viewer is asking if there's an alternative to elections in Africa. I just want to, let me qualify it to say, is there an alternative to the liberal election democratic type in Africa?
We are not saying alternative to election. Okay, any form, I always argue that election is at the heart of democracy. It's very, very central, is very, very critical to it. But when we are talking about the way we go about those elections, those conditions of liberal electoral democracy, okay? So we are saying it is important at this point for Africa or Africans to begin to have a conversation, to say, look, we have been conducting in Nigeria now. They spoke about South Africa, 30 years. Nigeria is 25 years. We've had 6 or 7 rounds of elections, but nothing has really changed. And the cost of conducting this election, electoral cycle, one after the other, is on the increase. And we are not getting value for money. So we are saying that, of course, it's an ongoing debate whether we can go back to begin to talk about African model of democracy and stuff like that. That conversation is on the table. But the key point is that we are sure that the process we have been following in conducting these elections, those processes have not delivered on the promise of democracy. And if you have been doing the same thing over and over again, you will continue to get the same result. So we need to revisit and have serious conversation around those issues.
Thank you about the conversational issues. You mentioned about courtocracy as one of the shortcomings of the current system of the elections we practice in Africa. I just want to draw some parallels because of the democratic values we're talking about. In the United States, for example, in 2000, Al Gore's decision, the Bush won because of a court decision. In 2016, Hillary Clinton claimed the elections were stolen, and in 2020, Donald Trump claimed the elections were stolen. So, is the problem African, or is it a problem with the liberal democracy itself?
Okay, there are 2 perspectives to that conversation. On the positive side, scholars have argued, and this is supported in the mainstream literature, that look, when political players decide to take their cases to court, when they are dissatisfied with the process and they go to court, scholars have argued that it is part and parcel of the process of institutionalization of politics and power. And that is a powerful statement that we cannot discredit, because the alternative to court is for people to resort to self-help strategies, to go to the street to begin to protest, to foment violence. So it is a positive development when people take cases arising from elections to court. But because we are dealing with weak institutions, okay, across virtually almost all segments of our societies, including the judiciary, including the electoral management body, okay, so the level of trust in the court system itself is suspect. And there are quite a number of survey data out to prove that. When they conduct survey about trust in government institutions in Africa, they talk about the police in Nigeria, they talk about the electoral management body, then the next thing you see is the judiciary in terms of the low level of trust of citizens in those institutions. So because of that low level of trust of citizens in those institutions, they believe that when you go to court, that for electoral justice, that probably the highest leader gets, the positive verdict, okay, at the expense of those with lean purse, Then, secondly, that at the end of the day, the will of the people is being subverted. And that when you are taking increasing number of cases, political cases to the court, you are exerting pressure on the judiciary that can lead to the additional corruption of the judicial system. And that is what we have been witnessing in many African countries, particularly in Nigeria. So those US instances you cited, yes, it is not every election that they end in court. So those are just exceptional cases and not across all phases of the election. But we are saying in Nigeria, for example, we've had an electoral cycle where you had over 5,000 cases across the various phases of the election before the different courts. So when you have those number of cases arising from one electoral cycle, my brother, it is not sustainable. You are exerting too much pressure on the judiciary, and you create opportunity for politicians to be able to penetrate and to corrupt them. That is the argument we are making.
Thank you so much, Prof. That was quite interesting, because I am looking at the current state of elections in Africa and the adoption of technology and how we can use technology to reduce the incidence of courtocracy so that people can actually believe in the ballot box rather than believe in the appointed judges who simply give their decisions based on the evidence tendered before them. So on this line, let me come to Dr. Robinson. In an article that Dr. Robinson wrote, he said that technology, cybersecurity, and the 2023 elections in Nigeria, prospects, challenges, and opportunities. So Dr. Robinson said, despite the positive contributions of technology to the quality and integrity of the electoral process, it has not been without attendant debates and controversies. In Kenya's 2013 general elections, the electoral body deployed technology which led to widespread failure with many technical challenges. Alebu documented some of the challenges experienced using biometric technology in Nigeria's 2015 elections, including reliability issues, equipment failure, and user challenges. Sibe argued that the 41% failure rate of the biometric process reported by INEC in the pilot test of the smart card reader technology in 2015 was too significant to ignore. Yet, INEC went ahead with the same technology in the national elections. So we are talking about cases where people have already determined that technology has problems, but they still keep on using it. Are you suggesting at any point that we should withdraw the technology itself, or are you suggesting that we should improve the way we use technology and integrate technology more effectively in the electoral management system?
Yeah, technology is not the problem. Technology could be the problem, but that's also because of the human behind the use of technology. And when we talk about using technology in election, it's something that has always been there for over a century, although very crude technology. From literature as early as 1900, over a century ago, there was a first recorded use of technology in an election where it was used basically for storage, use of mechanical levers. Also down to the 1960s where punch cards were used, down to when David Shum also introduced some sort of electronic voting system. Technology has always been there. And then the very sterling and brilliant example of Estonia, who was the first to do actually e-voting, internet voting, following the passage of their Rigokoku Electoral Act of 2002. So it's always been there, and it succeeded elsewhere. So the question we should ask ourselves is, how come it succeeded elsewhere and it hasn't succeeded here in Africa? In Nigeria, like I mentioned, you did cite the case from the article which I co-authored with Professor Christian Cornott. We have had a lot of challenges in Nigeria. From 1999, it was largely manual, and then in 2003, the first attempt to start some measure of computerization through the use of optical magnetic reader and the use of automatic fingerprint identification system, down to 2007, where the direct data capture machines were deployed, and then in 2015, where the smart card reader, like you just mentioned, was deployed, and then very recently, the BVAS, the Bimodal Voter Accreditation System. The sad reality is that in each of these elections, the election budget continues to increase because we keep dumping one technology for the other without actually asking ourselves the question, what was the cause of the problem? Was it just about technology, or was it about poor planning, or was it about sabotage, or was it about failure? You know, there are some underlying things which you need to find out when you're using, you know, technology. When I did a review of, you know, other places where technology is used and electoral systems, you know, the themes that emerged, you know, every electoral system must be correct. It must be said to be accurate. So the question we ask ourselves is, you know, these technologies we're using, how accurate is it? There also must be the right legal framework, to, because for any piece of technology to be recognized in an electoral process, there has to be the right legal framework. And, you know, the case in point for Nigeria in 2015, where the then Electoral Act did not contemplate the use of smart card reader at that level. Well, that was corrected eventually, particularly with the signing of the Electoral Act 2022. And then there are things like, you know, election using technology should not alter this principle of elections itself, which is that whatever technology you're using should mirror the traditional steps. It only brings in efficiency, but the fundamental principle of voter anonymity, you know, of accuracy and all of those things must be reflected in whatever technology you're deploying. And cybersecurity is a big issue now, because if you look at the electoral threat landscape, we have cybersecurity issues there, because if you look at the two elections in Ekiti, in Ondo State, the INEC chairman did say that there were lots of cyber attacks, particularly from Asia. The last election, the last presidential election in Nigeria, the then Minister of Communication and Innovation did say that over 12 million attacks were recorded according to the statements which they released, you know, in the period of the presidential election. So these are some of the issues. Also, there has to be a very good level of transparency. People need to see the end-to-end of it. There has to be trust in the system. There has to be the principle of audit and verification. Can you audit these systems? So these are questions which, you know, INEC brings in technology, but they do not allow stakeholders to interrogate this technology. So they bring a black box to you for you to use on an election day. In most cases, you see ad hoc staff not properly trained. In most cases, you see, even in courts, in litigation processes, that's electoral litigation, you know, you see where lawyers are not able to make the right argument. You see where parties are requesting for access to card readers or access to the BVAS, and they are not given access to it. You know, these are things that should be subjected to forensic, real forensic investigation. So these are things that are human induced, not necessarily because technology failed. I'm not going to give technology a bad name because humans failed, or because humans sabotaged it, or because humans didn't quite know what to do. You know, things like reliability, even when systems fail, if you subject it to a very great level of reliability test, you know, some of the things that happen on election day could have been spotted before the election, and it could have been fixed. In the last election, there was the issue of transmission, voter transmission, particularly in the presidential election, where the servers were said to have failed. And the reasons they gave had to do with, you know, resource squeeze, lack of having adequate resource, maybe bandwidth issues, I don't know. But these are things that could have been contemplated. If you're doing planning, you know, these are things that could have been contemplated. These are things private sector institutions, you know, handle. These are things banks handle. You know, we do online transfers. We do, you know, all sorts of things online, and these things work. So why can't we make it work in elections? I'll tell you the answer. The answer lies with the people, with humans. Technology is there to answer the questions of humans, or to do what the humans ask them to do.
Well, listening to you, I have the impression that you are putting the responsibility on the people managing the systems. Now, election is a multi-stakeholder business. What advice would you give to the opposition, especially because they're a critical stakeholder in this case? What advice do you give to them regarding the being tech savvy, regarding the management of the technical systems of elections? Because if you leave it only within the competence of those who are managing the system, they'll definitely do it the way they want. If there is no pressure, they will definitely have no incentive at all to do what they don't want to do. So what is that advice to the opposition?
Well, you're very right. Election is a multi-stakeholder thing. I take us back to one that happened in Germany. The first time Germany tried to do some sort of electronic voting, and a man and his son sued the German electoral body because the argument was that, look, for me to trust an electoral system, I have to be able to see it end to end. It has to be a transparent process, and that this thing you're bringing as technology is opaque to me. I can't see through it. I don't trust it. And he won the case. Himself and his son, they won the case, and that's why there's no electronic voting in Germany today. And the thing is, they didn't annul the election, but they stopped it thereafter. So while you might argue, yeah, opposition and all that, but I think it goes beyond the opposition. It's a multi-stakeholder thing, and we should begin to ask these questions. INEC, before you use a technology, for instance, INEC should subject it to multi-stakeholder interaction. INEC should bring in third parties. So you look at best practice. If you look at Estonia, which is a brilliant example of a nation that uses technology at a very high level, people who audit the electoral process are not members of the electoral body. They are private sector people. They are systems people. They are systems auditors. They are certified auditors. There's also the end-to-end verifiability of the process. So we have to collectively push, and the opposition figures, naturally they are opposition, so expectedly they probably will take the lead. But those who are opposition today might get into power tomorrow. So that's why I'm careful to use the word opposition. The people who are in power today in Nigeria, they were opposition in 2015. So it's something that all well-meaning citizens should be able to ask these questions, should be able to push for these things to be done. If you're doing an election with technology, or you're introducing a new piece of technology, one of the best practices is pilot testing. And in this case, INEC did pilot testing. In some other climes, like in Kenya, the first time that there was a failure in 2013, not sure there was proper pilot testing at the time. But then when you do proper pilot testing, what do you learn? The lessons you learn from it, did you apply anything? Did you learn from it? Did you get stakeholders to interrogate the process? Did you tell us the protocol to extract data, to extract digital evidence? So if, for instance, a client is interested in investigating what happened at a particular polling unit and there was a beavers, and is interested in carrying out a forensic investigation of that, have you documented the step-by-step process of extracting digital evidence from that device, in line with best practice, to make it forensically sound and to make it legally defensible? Those are protocols and processes that has to be clearly established. And these are the things that will make someone have, trust in the system. If you go, I keep going back to the banking system. If you go to the banking system, there's an SOP for everything. It's an SOP for your audit. There's also business continuity plan in case of issues, disaster recovery plan in case of issues. Do we have such documentation in the electoral bodies? So it requires a total overhaul of the people, the process, and the systems.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Robinson. You mentioned the evidence question. You mentioned litigation. Let me switch over to Dr. Carroll. From the legal standpoint, there are cybersecurity laws, there are election laws. Do you have the impression that the African system, or most countries in Africa, are adopting cybersecurity laws with the notion that those laws could govern elections at some point?
I am not very informed about cybersecurity law, so I'm not in the best position to, to give an accurate response to that. And I would like to, ask for the permission to, respond to the question that was asked regarding whether there is any alternative to liberal democracy.
Carry on.
I would like to respond. I would like to, add to what Professor Omotola, explained relating to that question. Right. Just like Prof said, the problem that we have in Africa is our African political leaders, they are just not accommodative to, to change or to new ideas or to try new things, right? Many scholars have proposed, alternative models to, the forms of liberal democracy that are currently in practice in Africa, which are not working, right? I, for example, have conceptualized a model which I describe as right to development governance, right? I am very convinced that that model, if applied, can make significant difference in Africa. The reason why liberal democracy is not workable in Africa is because these are systems that we inherited from colonialism. We inherited this system from our colonial, from the colonizers. And those systems were not designed to enable Africa advance. They were designed, to serve the purpose, to serve the interest of the colonizers and the imperialists. They have not worked in Africa, and I don't see them working anytime soon or in the near future. So it is time for African leaders to start to think of alternative models. There are models that scholars have, suggested, which need to be explored. If you don't try alternatives, you will not be able to make an accurate choice. Right? So, relating to what I call right to development governance, this model, I conceptualize it, based on a reverse engineering theory, right? You look at what you intend to achieve, and then you walk back to where you are and start to determine, the steps and the processes, to get to what you want to achieve. So, if in Africa the issues that we have in Africa are issues relating to poverty, issues relating to underdevelopment, and we intend to redress those issues, then we need to be able to conceptualize a model, a democratic model, or a governance model that would respond to those challenges. Otherwise, whatever system that we apply would probably not, redress those challenges. So, about the right to development governance that I'm talking about, it is, informed by the right to development, which is enshrined in the African Charter, in Article 22 of the African Charter, which guarantees that all the peoples of Africa have the right to development. And this concept of the right to development, even though now it is, internationally recognized, it actually originated from Africa immediately, shortly after decolonization. A number of prominent African leaders and scholars, they started articulating the fact that the peoples of Africa deserve the right to be, to be granted the right to development, right? And that concept, was articulated and eventually, evolved and has been embraced by many other countries, the G77 member countries. They embrace that concept and have driven it to the extent that some have actually, used that model, and it has worked for them so, so well. China, for example, in 2016, China issued a white paper on the right to development, and China explained that their model of development is based on the fact that the Chinese people are entitled to the right to development. And, following that model, China has been able to uplift 800 million people out of poverty. The statistics have been confirmed by the World Bank, within a period of 30 to 40 years, right? So a concept that originated from Africa, we haven't been able to use it to our benefit, but, a very good example is China, that has used that model and has been able to, deal with the problem of poverty in the country. Before now, China used to be one of the most impoverished countries around the world, but today, no country can compete with China in terms of levels of development, right? Which, as it is explained in the white paper that they issued in 2016, they basically adopted the model of the right to development, and they've been able to, to achieve that level of development for the country. So it is, left to us scholars and African leaders, to explore the alternative models to the liberal democracy that we have been, practicing, which hasn't worked, it's not going to work, and it is high time we, look at other models. There are other models. It's just that our African leaders are not yet open to, looking at the workability of the other models that have been proposed. Lost contact.
Not hearing you. I'm sorry, I'm not hearing you at all.
Okay.
Okay, yeah, I can hear you now.
Okay, that question was essentially designed for Dr. Ngang since he's back. So in the 2019 article, you concluded that there is an essence in giving a substance of the right to development, in which states are granted both the right and the duty to formulate domestic development policies that reflect the aspirations of the people. In one of your statements previously, you said the problem in Africa is the systems are not working because they're inherited and were not designed to advance Africa. So 60 years after independence, are we still on that same track? What is actually holding us back from doing what should actually work for us?
Yeah, the systems are not working in the sense like Prof had earlier mentioned. Our development is still largely funded by external actors like the World Bank, the IMF, donor countries. So it is commonly said that he who pays the piper determines the tune, right? So if our development is funded by external actors, it is very certain, very obvious that they would determine what our leaders need to do to serve their interests, to serve the purpose for which they provided the funding. I think it would not. It is no surprise for us to know that the African Union is 80% of the African Union budget is funded by the European Union. So you will not expect the African Union to be able to take any decision or adopt any policies that would aim to, advance Africa, but rather they would do, or they would take decisions or make policies that would serve the interests of their donors. Same thing for every African country, right? In spite of the provision on the right to development that requires states to adopt policies, to ensure the improvement of the well-being of their people. African countries, because they don't have that sovereignty, they don't enjoy, that sovereignty, they are not able to, take or make the kind of policies that would respond to the exigencies of the peoples of Africa. They will not be able to take policies that would enable the eradication of poverty in Africa. Most often, the policies that they adopt are, to satisfy donor conditionalities, right? So that is the state at which we are in Africa. China has been able to, advance to the extent to which it has because of, China enjoys that liberty to, that sovereignty to make policies that, are intended to address the developmental exigencies of the Chinese people. In Africa, we are still very far from that, from exercising that right to sovereignty, that right to self-determination, to be able to, proactively adopt policies that would advance the African continent and the interests of the African peoples.
Thank you, Prof. Let me switch to Professor Omotola. You had mentioned this at the beginning of at the end of your first prise de parole, but I stopped so that we talk about this later on. There's a paper you wrote on constitutional changes of government in Africa. What implications for democratic consolidation? And you say this paper also advances the argument that military takeovers will remain a viable source of democratic regression on the continent, in as much as insufficient efforts are made to deal with their predisposing factors, especially bad governance in all its ramifications. I know in the paper you touched some elements that constitute the unconstitutional takeover of power. Can you throw more light on this, especially in light of the current coups that happened in West Africa, and if you are seeing the continent falling into more coups d'etats in the days ahead?
Okay, thank you so much, Mr. Moderator. It's my interest to know that I wrote that paper in 2011. I think it was published in 2011. And as at that time, based on certain considerations, I came to that conclusion that going forward, that we may continue to witness the resurgence of military coups on the continent of Africa, and that is exactly what we have been witnessing the last couple of years now. And I think for me, the explanation for that lies in the deepening crisis and contradiction, not just of governance, but even of the state in itself in Africa. And this point I want to make about the African state connects to the point by Professor Carroll's on the form and character of the African state. The key issue for me is the fact that development is not on the political agenda of the current political elites across different countries in Africa. And when any country does not, as a matter of deliberate policy, I mean, you have to be intentional about it to make development a cardinal principle of the political agenda. As long as development is not critical, is not central to the political agenda of those elite of power, these are the kind of tendencies we're going to continue to experience. And I think the greatest manifestation of that lies in my earlier analogy about what I call democratic disequilibrium on the continent. That democracy promised so much, okay, at inception, okay, under this third wave. And people embraced it because they made a lot of promise to them that once you have democracy, every other thing, development will follow. But decades down the line, the reverse is the case. So there is a kind of gap, a mismatch, okay, between the promise of democracy and what democracy has been able to deliver. And that gap is what I call democratic disequilibrium. You know, in ordinary demand and supply theories, you know, once there is disequilibrium, there will be crisis. So what we are witnessing now is a manifestation of the instability of the crisis as a result of democratic disequilibrium, the mismatch between the demand for democracy and the supply of democracy. So all those things are deeply rooted in the deepening crisis and contradiction of governance on the continent. And of course, there are so many dimensions to that deepening crisis and contradiction of governance. But for me, the key foundation of that is the crisis of the state. Can we actually, which country can you look at in Africa now and speak of that country as a state in the real sense of that term? Because when you speak about a state, there are certain defining attributes of a state, okay? But by the time you begin to pick all those attributes of a state one by one, and you begin to relate them to different African countries, I'm not sure how many countries we actually qualify as state in the real sense of the term on the continent. So, and what does that tell us? It's simply showing that most of the things we refer to as states in Nigeria, they are just geographical political entities, okay, for the accumulation of resources. And that was why when my brother was talking about cybersecurity and you were talking about opposition, I just smiled. It's not a question for the opposition, whether it is opposition or those in government. The development agenda is very, very low, if you have it at all, on their political agenda. And once that gap is there, it's going to be difficult to move the state forward. So most of the states in Africa, they lack the capacity in every sense of that term. You know, when you speak about state capability, there are different dimensions to it: military capability, technological, bureaucratic, administrative, and so on and so forth. So how many states in Africa can you point at and say, yes, in terms of bureaucratic administrative capability, that this state is top-notch? How many of them? You now begin to see the kind of pathologies that the public bureaucracy is radiating across many African countries. If you go to the military, you have terrorism, different forms of insurgencies across different African countries. What have they been able to do about it? Okay, these are questions that feed into the question of state capability. Another component of state capability is the ability to generate resources, to generate their own fund, okay, adequately and effectively manage and administer that fund. How many African countries can generate their own fund without resorting to borrowing? Dr. Klaus made the right point. Yes, African Union, 80% of their budget comes from external donors. So in that kind of situation, you can't be the master of your own game. You have to listen to some external voices, okay, before you can take certain critical decisions about the continent. So I think for me, the point is that we are confronted with a deepening crisis and contradiction of governance on the continent. And as a result of that crisis of governance, you now see so many other things following, leading to crisis of development everywhere you turn, okay? You see structures of government everywhere, but you hardly see governance. Okay, so that is why I challenge some scholars when they speak about ungoverned spaces in terms of those territories that are not occupied by government institutions. I said we need to begin to extend that definition of ungoverned spaces beyond that in Africa, Because there are so many spaces occupied by government where you see government structures, you see government institutions, you see laws, you see law enforcement agencies, and yet nothing is happening in those spaces, in those territories. So by every standard, those kind of spaces also qualified to be referred to as ungoverned spaces. And you have so many of them across so many countries on the continent. But to relate to this idea of saying that yes, most of our social structures were either imported from the metropole, okay? Some of them, when they got here, some they met, they were transformed. That was the argument of PPAK in his seminal article, Colonialism and the Two Publics, you know. But again, we need to begin to ask the question, several decades after the attainment of that flag independence, what have we been able to do to change the situation? And I think for me, yes, we cannot exonerate colonialism from some of these things we are seeing, because as scholars have argued, we need to understand colonialism as an epochal event, okay, whose implications transcend the borderland of the so-called attainment of political independence. We are still seeing the manifestation of the negative consequences of colonialism. That is fine. But there are many other ex-colonies too. Okay, America was also colonized. Most developed countries of the world today, they were at one time or the other under colonialism. So why is our own situation different in Africa? So we cannot continue to reify that colonial argument that because we were colonized, yes, we were colonized, and colonizing did a lot of terrible things to Africa in terms of depopulation, you know, taking away our resources and stuff like that. Fine. But the key point is that our political leaders, since the attainment of political independence in most African countries, the point is that they have continued to make themselves available as agents, okay, of those ex-colonial powers. And this is much more prominent in ex-French colonies, okay? And that is why when you look at those tendencies of coups that we are talking about now, virtually all the recent coups took place in ex-French colonies, okay, in Africa. And I think that has to do with the post-colonial or post-independent policies of France. There's something they call France Afrique. I don't speak French, I don't know the correct pronunciation. So, France Afrique, that is the root of some of the discontent that we are seeing in those ex-French colonies now, where those coups are happening. You now begin to see a situation where citizens are trooping to the street to celebrate military adventurism, military system of power. And what does that tell us? I want people, we should not misinterpret that to mean that people now prefer military autocracy to democracy. No, it was a spontaneous response, okay, to express their popular discontent, disaffection, okay, with the content and the delivery of democracy in those various countries. So the truth of the matter is that democracy has not delivered. The way we have it today, this liberal version has not delivered. And because of that, people are coming out to the streets to celebrate when the military seized power in those countries. But after those dust settle down, I think people are beginning to have a reconsideration that, look, yes, this is just a temporary relief. A temporary relief in the sense that if you go back to the history of military autocracy on the continent, some of them will start as revolutionary forces, but they end up as reactionary forces. So I don't know any country where you can point out under military administration that they actually transformed their countries and laid the foundation for future sustainable development in those countries. So it's a big challenge. We need to find a way of addressing the crisis and contradiction of governance on the continent. And if we don't address those contradictions, I'm afraid, because those features you saw in those countries where the military took power, you find them across virtually almost all the countries in Africa. So where the military has not taken over, it's not because those pathologies are not manifesting. Maybe the civilian administration in those countries find a way of co-opting of integrating the military elite into that structure, you know, of resource distribution, of state capturing and stuff like that. So we call it strategy of co-optation. So if they have been able to co-opt them into that process of national resource or asset sharing, then definitely at the top level of the military, they will continue to play along with the civilian leadership of the country. But it is a dangerous signal that someday, somewhere, somehow, there can be a breakdown in that process of co-optation and the military can strike in any part of the continent.
All right, thank you, Prof. So the difference here, or another strategy that could lead to this conflict or to an alternative to military takeover could be civil war or civil protests. Is that correct?
Definitely.
But then the difficulty here is the military, because the military is in bed with the government. It will be the military will actually fight against the population that is on the streets or trying to take over or trying to liberate themselves.
Yes, yes. You have raised an important point about these alternative forms of unconstitutional change of government, because even in the definition provided by the African Union itself, it is not only military coup that constitutes unconstitutional change of government. They talk about instances where an incumbent loses election and refuses to hand over to the opposition that won. And I think we saw that at the point in Cote d'Ivoire, in Zimbabwe, you know, and we knew the kind of post-election violence that followed after that. So for the African Union, that constitutes an important component of constitutional change of government. But again, when you see insurgents, okay, dissidents, trying to forcefully seize power through the Bush path, for the African Union, that's another important component of constitutional change of government. But when you look around now and look at the level, the various forms of insurgencies that many African countries, especially in the Sahel, in West Africa, are contending with. Nigeria, for example, how many secessionist movements or groups do we have now? Before we used to talk about only Biafra, but it's no longer Biafra now. Even surprisingly recently, a group from a very small group of people from the southwest, the Yoruba, saying they were agitating for independent Republic of Oduduwa, you know, and they made certain moves to that effect. So every part, anywhere you turn in Nigeria today, the north, the east, the west, everywhere, there is one form of movement or the other, either violent or not violent, agitating for separation. So, and these things are replicated in many other African countries. So the danger with that is that by the time they are able to grow their membership, by the time they are able to disseminate their ideology and they have higher level of penetration in terms of those ideologies that they represent, it becomes a dangerous development for the country. So the solution to that, again, because the way the state responds to some of these agitations is also very, very important. It's not everything you respond to militarily, thinking that you have to suppress them by force, okay? That can lead to radicalization. So you must find a way of establishing a balance between military responses and non-military responses to some of these issues we are talking about. Bring people to the round table, have conversations. What are the grievances? What are the issues? Dialogue, negotiate, and see how maybe you can come to town, find a meeting point in the course of negotiation.
Thank you, Prof. I would like to switch to Dr. Carroll, but one point you insisted on was the African Union position on the unconstitutional takeover of power. And it would appear the African Union is bent on ensuring that there is no unconstitutional takeover of power, and ECOWAS is following that same school of thought. But when situations are ripe for that to happen, we don't see ECOWAS and the AU prohibiting or telling the governments to come and neutralize the situation. For instance, you see what happened in Togo, the constitutional amendment that actually changed the constitution. The president is no longer going to be elected, the parliament is going to elect. That is already grounds for a possible coup d'etat or popular uprising. But why do these institutions take a long time to intervene at the right time. They don't intervene at the right time. They come in after the fact. Why is that prominent on the continent?
Is that, I should say something about that?
Yes, Prof.
Okay, yeah, thank you so much for that important question. You know, both the African Union and the ECOWAS, they have their anti-coup norms, okay? And in my study of that norms, I came up with at least 7 inherent weaknesses, okay, or criticisms that people have raised against either in theory or in practice, why those norms have not been able to prevent the resurgence of military coups on the continent. One key element of those criticisms is the fact that, and that is what those recent military leaders are doing, are even threatening to quit ECOWAS. They are saying, look, when we were going through all those terrible situations, deteriorating security, human insecurity, and stuff like that, where was the African Union? Where was ECOWAS at that point in time? They didn't come to see how they can assist them to address those issues. Now the military took over power. They are saying they wanted to impose tax, and they are saying they should go to hell. So it's a valid and abiding concern that most of these organizations, they just turn out those norms, but they don't invest in preventive measures. They wait for those things to happen before they begin to respond. And by that time, it will have been too late. Of course, there are so many other criticisms that people have made about that. For example, the issue of double standard in the applications of those anti-coup norms or protocols. Okay, and they will cite the example. Which country now? Is it Burkina Faso? You know, there are even the example of Egypt too in 2014, 2015. So there were so many examples people will tell you about double standard in the applications of those norms. So for me, the key thing is that those norms they invested so much on reactionary measures after the fact instead of investing more in preventive measures. So I think that has been part of the challenge, and that is why it's been extremely difficult for ECOWAS to manage the situation in the Sahel. You know, Niger, Burkina Faso, Chad, you know, they are even forming an alliance now against ECOWAS. So I don't know how far ECOWAS has gone, but I know at a point in time, those countries announced their withdrawal of membership from ECOWAS. But I know there are procedures they have to follow to formalize that. So it got to a point ECOWAS had no choice than to lift some of the sanctions they imposed of them. And that is a dangerous trend because it's actually showing with that particular development that ECOWAS is losing its power, okay, its authority, okay, to actually enforce its own rules within its own organization. And I think that is a very, very bad signal to send.
Thank you, Prof. Let me switch to Dr. Carroll. Prof mentioned the need for governments and stakeholders in the various countries to sit and talk in order to avoid political conflict. And that is logical. It makes a lot of sense. There is no need to think further than this. Dialogue resolves problems and even prevents problems. But the aid donors, when they give developmental aid, they attach conditions to the aid. Why, in your opinion, would they not oblige governments to sit and talk with dissenting voices when the dissent becomes too loud? There are examples of conflicts in Africa where people are dying daily, even if it's not being reported in the news. But these development organizations are not imposing that condition that if you do not sit and talk, we are going to pass sanctions. In your view, why is that not a critical issue for development organizations and aid-giving countries?
Well, the response is very obvious and clear. It is not, for the benefit of Africa, whatever, is happening. The development agencies, they ensure that everything that happens within Africa goes to serve their interests. So we take, for example, the Agenda 2063 that the African Union adopted, as a roadmap for development on the continent. go to, do an inquiry on the extent to which the African Union has met with the plans that it outlined in Agenda 2063. A lot of the aspirations that are outlined in Agenda 23 have not, met the deadlines which they were set to meet, right? And obviously, because, if that agenda had to be implemented the way it is going to move Africa forward. And so the donors are keen to ensure that, Africa doesn't, get to implement the aspirations contained in the framework for development of the continent. Another issue is that lack of sovereignty, that lack of, the proactiveness to assert sovereignty and the right to self-determination, to be able to, make appropriate policies and decisions that are in favor of Africa. Maybe because too of, the threat that stands right at the neck of our African political leaders, military bases all across the continent, with the threat to bring down any leader that, tries to bring reform. We have very obvious examples of Libya, where when Gaddafi was, taken out for trying to, institute reforms that would, move Africa forward, right? So, like Prof said, one problem that we've had in Africa is the fact that we are operating in silos. The academics are, making all the research and producing the findings and making recommendations, which with the hope that our political leaders would, take those recommendations and be able to implement them. But we can confess that it is very, in very limited instances that our political leaders actually, take the research that is produced on the African continent seriously, right? So we have this scenario where, academics are saying what needs to be done, the politicians are doing what they think is relevant for them, and then trying to satisfy their donors, right? So we have that disparity. We have that, that scenario where there is no compromise in terms of research that is produced, recommendations that are made, and policy making, either at the level of the African Union or at the domestic level of individual member states. So until we, get to that point where, the politicians start to talk and understand, have understanding between the politicians and the academics and policymakers, there we would be able to, make advancement. Without that, I think that we still have a long way to go.
Thank you. Let me come to Dr. Robinson, talking about the policy framework, framing policy in Africa. We are at the point where Professor Shola spoke about a disequilibrium in policy making, and technology is quite advancing in the rest of the world, and it's advancing development, and the overflow of that development is seen in how they use technology to advance elections, democracy, development, health, education. Do you see that the development of the technology policy in Africa is intentional, or is it just haphazard, or just happens, or is going as it's happening?
Well, there's been quite some positives. On the strategic level, I think that it's been disjointed largely and isolated. So you see a few isolated policies that are good, but not in any handshake with any other policy. Policies work hand in hand, for a common purpose. So that's one challenge which we have in Africa. You see, for instance, I like to use the case of Estonia as a common example. Estonia, when they came up with the Electoral Act, the Rigikoko Electoral Act, it wasn't an act in isolation. It was an act that relied on several other acts, their Identity Act, their Population Act, their digital signatures, and all of those other acts which all work together. For instance, I give you an example. In Nigeria, you have an INEC that has to generate their own citizen database. In Estonia, they rely on the population database. Now, these are citizens, the same set of citizens, but every institution have their own respective database for which they use very large, very high sums of money to acquire. The banks have their database, a driver's license have a database, the immigration has a database, the National Electoral Commission has a database. So you have disparate databases all over the place. So we need to sit down if we want to make laws. Policies should be done, in a way that they are not conflicting, in a way that they support each other to achieve a common purpose.
Yeah, thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, if you're just joining us now, we are celebrating Professor Shola, and in honor of his 50th birthday, we are discussing and reflecting on the state of elections, democracy, and development in Africa. And we have in our presence Dr. Shola himself and Dr. Robinson and Dr. Carol Ngang. And we are moving towards the end of this webinar. I would like us to look forward. I would like us to look forward now and look at those countries that are facing elections in the months ahead. What advice would we give to those countries? Because we want to see a continent where development, democracy, and elections actually transform the face of the continent. We have agreed that the situation is not very good. Liberal democracy might not be the best for the continent, but that is what we have at hand now. So what are those practical advice, counsel that we can give to those countries that are going into elections within the next few months? You can advise the government, you can advise the political parties, you can advise the civil society, you can advise whomsoever you want to advise. But I want us to go into that exercise now, so we don't just we are not stuck in criticizing, right? Let us propose something for the future. Let me start with you, Dr. Robinson.
Well, I'd leave Professor Omotola and Dr. Carol to do a lot of the advice from the political side of things. So I'll just focus on the IT side of things. Most of the problems we have had in Africa in terms of elections and technology in election, it's always been down to complaints such as, there was a failure, or there was a sabotage, and all of those things. A lot of this has to do with the fact that the planning is usually very poor. They wait till election day before they deploy some of these technologies. Stakeholders are not brought together, early enough. You cannot use a piece of technology which you fabricated from somewhere, from a private entity, a limited liability company somewhere in another country. You bring it to your country to conduct elections, and you expect that people are just going to trust it right away. No, it's important that you bring the stakeholders together to have a proper interaction with the system, to be able to test it, to be able to verify the authenticity of it, and to be able to interact with it. These are the things that will build trust. You also need to leverage the technical capacity of your citizens. It's not a thing that, for instance, if it's in Nigeria, you say, oh, INEC will be the ones to conduct election, INEC will be the ones to produce auditors, INEC will be the ones to do everything. And you know very well that these organizations don't have that level of capacity in-house. So they have to have a lot of stakeholder engagement, a lot of training, a lot of simulation, a lot of tabletop exercise to be able to stress test the technology. We know the number of registered voters. Let's say we know it to be 84 million. And you wait until election day to see what happens if 84 million votes are being transmitted, on election day. No, you can actually simulate these things. You can stress test your network, so they need to do this. Also, there has to be written protocols, for this. When you're doing your electoral risk management, if you do it properly and efficiently, most of the risk that would eventually might crystallize on election day, you would have been able to identify it. And once you identify it, then you define, how to contain or avoid it or mitigate it, in a way that will not disrupt the electoral process. So in a nutshell, there has to be proper planning. There has to be a lot of stakeholder engagement. There has to be pilot testing. There has to be reliability testing, and there has to be a lot of communication, strategic communications. I think I'll stop for now and I'll allow Prof and Dr. Carol to do justice to it.
All right, thank you. Let me get Dr. Carol. So what is the advice you're going to give to those countries that are going into elections in the next months and within the next year?
Okay, thanks. Let me start by highlighting the fact that one of the things that has held Africa back is the politics of divide and rule, right? Africa has not been able to, advance much because of, entrenched division across the continent, right? So South Africa is one of the countries that is in election mood. Their elections are coming up in the next few days on the 29th of this month. And one thing that's very interesting about the South African elections is the fact that Julius Malema's party, the Economic Freedom Fighters, they are running their campaign on the platform of African unity and economic freedom, right? Even though there is a lot of controversy about that within South Africa, there are factions that, are not agreeing to the fact that Africa needs to unite, but Julius Malema has been, breaking, ground on in his election campaign, right? He used to be, I think, the party used to occupy around the third or fourth position, but currently the opinion polls show that they are likely to come first in the elections or at least second, right? And hopefully, if the AFF gets to power with that ideology of African unity and they are able to drive that through, that might be one strategic way by which to start to resolve some of the issues that we have talked about in Africa, issues relating to democracy, liberal democracy, issues relating to governance, and issues relating to development. I would want to think that if other countries that are in election mood, if they could also buy this idea of African unity and start to drive that ideology, that can pave a way for Africa. Our early leaders like Kwame Nkrumah, they actually propagated this idea of African unity. At the time that Kwame Nkrumah talked about African unity, the idea wasn't as popular, and it couldn't it did not materialize. But currently, the extent to which the youths have embraced the issue of African unity, it's really phenomenal. When you go through social media platforms like TikTok and Facebook, you find a lot of live shows where this idea of African unity is being driven very fervently. So I think that that can be one strategy by which we can start to try to address some of the issues that we've highlighted in this show.
Thank you, thank you, Dr. Carroll. Let's hear from Prof. The advice he's going to give to those countries that are going into elections within the next few weeks or months and year.
Okay, thank you so much, my brother. Let me start from this very platform, what I think this platform can do to assist that process in those countries. I think maybe beyond a general webinar of this nature that goes across Africa, maybe you should begin to identify each of those countries, okay, go into election. Maybe in the order of the election of the African electoral calendar. I think Comoros is the first one to come. I look at the calendar somewhere. Maybe you can begin to have specific webinar, maybe put 2 or 3 of those countries together, then bring experts on those countries to come and have this kind of conversations about the elections coming up in those countries. I think those country experts will be able to give country-specific recommendations, and I think this platform is a very, very veritable one that can assist in propagating that. Now, going to the main issue, I think the first thing for me is that the question of ownership of that electoral and democratic process is very, very critical. And I think the people are the real owner of democracy. Democracy is basically about the people. So, and I think why we are having some of these problems we are talking about is because that the real owners of that process have been alienated, okay, have been disempowered. I think the first thing we need to do, if we are going to reclaim the electoral and democratic processes in Africa, is that the real owners will have to rise up and begin to demand, not just demand, to take steps to reclaim what rightly belongs to them. And I think the young people in Senegal, I think they have shown the example, okay, that you can actually organize, not agonize, okay? You can agonize, forming youth groups, women group, coalitions, and stuff like that to actually reclaim ownership of these whole processes. And we can do that by, one, deciding on our own that we will always do what is right in the course of the electoral processes, that we will not succumb to this idea of vote buying. We will not sell our votes, that we will not indulge in any form of electoral violence or electoral fraud and stuff like that. So the point I'm trying to make is that that transformation process begins with each and every one of us in our respective countries, especially those that are going to have election this year. The third point I want to make is that we need to be careful about this issue of fake news. Is becoming a major threat now to our electoral processes in many countries in Africa. Fake news, hate speeches, and we know what they can resort into, and we know what they have led to in some countries. It can degenerate into violence. If not well managed, it can deteriorate into outright civil war. And I think stakeholders will have to pay attention to that. Have electoral peace committee, whatever name they want to call it, where the main stakeholders, the main actors across political parties will be brought together around the table to sign a peace accord. To say, look, in this election, our electionary campaign will be based on issues, okay, instead of smear campaign. Now, the question of election security is very, very important. Election security, because it's different from the conventional security. The processing, the issues that are involved are different. I think those countries will have to invest more, okay, in the issue of election security, either by way of retraining and retraining those security agents that we have to provide election security, in terms of paying more attention to their welfare needs on the day of the elections, because I have seen it in a few instances where people were sent on election security assignments without adequate motivation. So when they got to the field, it became very easy for the politicians to buy them over to do certain things that were not actually very, very proper and helpful in those processes. But I think, again, the electoral management body is the most important actor, especially on the day of the election. So I think the way they comport themselves, okay, is also very, very important. Yet it begins from the way the composition of the EMB. We cannot begin to, because I know all those countries already have the EMB on the ground. But I think eternal vigilance is the most important key that we need in this respect. And who are those to do that? The people, of course, through civil society organizations, okay, through the media, to continue to socialize, to educate the people, okay, about their responsibilities in the electoral processes, and to continue to ram it on those managers of those processes that look, the future, the fate of the entire nation, of so number of people is in your hand. So the way you behave will go a long way to determine what will happen to the population of that particular country. So I think to wrap it up is our collective responsibility to play our roles as individuals in the little pocket of spaces that we occupy. That way, I think we'll be making some progress in moving our electoral processes forward.
Thank you so much, Prof. I did not want to respond to any of your recommendations, but because you made a specific recommendation to this platform, I think I need to respond to that. And thank you so much for recognizing the value that this platform is contributing towards the conversation. It's been our objective from the very beginning to make this platform that African platform where Africans can talk amongst themselves and generate ideas and action that can transform the continent. So yes, we are up to it. We are ready to organize as many webinars as possible to discuss African affairs, to discuss African politics, to discuss the development of Africa. The only thing we're asking is experts like you should show up, show your willingness to come and talk, and we would have you here anytime, any day, anyhow. We would have you here. We will talk. Our people need to talk, and we should also spread the message, share this communication to others. It's been a very fruitful 2 hours of communication. It's like we should keep on going, but we are at the end of the session. We are 3 minutes on the line, and I would like each and every one of you to give your final word. I would like this time to start with Prof. Because he's the birthday boy, so he should give us his final word as we are signing out of this conversation.
Okay, thank you so much. Let me use this opportunity to express my profound gratitude and appreciation to you for putting this thing together on this very important platform. I must also appreciate you for dishing out this big and leading expert on the subject matter. I think it was such a big honor for them to have accepted to be part of this program and to have made these fantastic contributions in the for the past 2 hours. I deeply appreciate this, and definitely going forward, I will link up after this program. Then finally, let me thank all the participants. I have read through the comments. They have made a lot of useful contributions and from different African countries. I think that is impressive. I sincerely appreciate all of you for finding time, despite your tight schedule, to be part of this program. Thank you so much, and God bless you.
Thank you so much, Prof. Dr. Carol, can you give us a final word?
Yes, I really appreciate the opportunity to speak on your platform, and also, the honor to connect with Professor Omotola and to share, to be inspired by his wisdom and expertise, and also our colleague, the IT guy, for his contributions to the show, and all the participants for their comments and their suggestions. I just saw a last suggestions on, possible topics that we need to discuss on, which is very inspiring. So, Prof, I want to say thank you again very much, and wish you, a blessed 50th anniversary celebration.
Thank you so much.
As we've discussed, we'll keep in touch. You are an inspiration that we will not afford to avoid.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Dr. Robinson, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Bernard. It's been very interesting 2 hours of very robust discussion. I've thoroughly enjoyed myself, and I've learned from the very incisive contributions by Prof and by Dr. Carroll. So this is me saying thank you once again for the opportunity, and also to urge you to keep doing what you're doing. I was privileged to be the index host, the first guest of this program. And it's always my honor to come back anytime you call. And I'll end again by once again wishing Prof a happy New Year and another glorious 50 years ahead. Should you desire to, in good health and with joyfulness and with all the desires of your heart granted to you. God bless you. We'll keep in touch, and we'll take it up from here. Same thing with Dr. Carroll. We'll try and connect with you after now, and we'll keep in touch. Thank you, and Billy.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Prof. Happy birthday again. Thank you, Dr. Carroll. Thank you, Dr. Robinson, for participating in this conversation. Thank you, dear viewers, for coming to talk with us. Thank you for the comments. Thank you for the contributions, and thank you for
please before you go, can you just say a word about our friend Charles Nkyo?
Okay, that's fine. Yeah. So as Prof is saying, Dr. Charles Nyekongi has been a friend of mine from secondary school days, and we've kept close contact. And he's in South Africa. He travels around the world all the time. So I don't even know if he's in Ethiopia or he's in the United States now. But he travels around the world for work. He's an avid researcher, and he's a man of good networking. He connected me to Prof. And he told me Prof is someone who is going to take this opportunity. And Prof's humility, Prof's availability is an example that we should follow. When I got to Prof and Prof accepted to come to this program, Charles told me, humble people don't complicate life. Their results speak for themselves. And as all of you have witnessed, Prof has actually been very, very instrumental. And you see the depth of knowledge he has. All the 3 panelists, depth of knowledge they have. And we are moving forward, and we are going to be moving forward. There is no turn back. There is no regression. There is no stagnation. And just to indicate,
so much,
and as all the panelists said, we are going to organize country-specific webinars here. Next on, in 2 weeks, we are organizing a webinar with the Senegalese youth in the diaspora. We want to learn from them how they organized themselves, how they contributed to the developments that we saw in Senegal. Everyone is excited about the developments in Senegal, but there was work done behind the scenes. And that work was done by the Senegalese themselves and Senegalese youths. So in 2 weeks, we're going to have them here, and they will share their experiences. So watch out for the invitation. Watch out for the links to join. And thank you so much for joining. We are so happy that all of you came in here. And thank you again for your contributions. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for your comments. And above all, thank you for your time. Until then, see you next time. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Sure. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.